to begin by presenting Esther, who is the first one talking. Esther Igual-Lafuente es graduada en Traducción y Mediación Interlingüística, UV, y posee el máster en Investigación en Lenguas y Literaturas, UV, y el máster de Formación de Profesorado, UOC. Es doctoranda en la Universitat de València con contrato de atracció de talent. Investiga la presentación del animal en el cine underground. Ha participado en congresos internacionales y ha sido becaria de la Embajada de Francia en España. Ha realizado estancias de investigación en Angers, Nantes y Lausanne. También colabora en diversos proyectos de investigación interdisciplinarios. So, whenever you want to start, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much for the presentation, and today I will be talking about the non-human agency in the underground films on the Plasticocene and Wasteocene. And as she said, I want to start by thanking the French Ambassador in Spain for giving me this opportunity too. And my university, my home university, because that is where in France during one day where I could interview this underground cinema curator. And today I'll be giving a definition, I'll be talking about him, and then I'll be showing the corpus and analyzing the diverse alternative techniques, space and time, the concept of zoocinematicity, which I called, and then I will come to some conclusions. So why this topic? So non-human animals remain marginalized and silenced both in society and mainstream visual media. And in response, over the last decade, French underground and experimental cinema has developed innovative forms of representing non-human animals in film, offering a critical perspective and alternative to anthropocentric narratives in mainstream media. And why France? So first, in literature, we see that these types of alternative representations first develop in Great Britain, the UK, and then move to France, and then go to other countries, right? So that's why we chose this nation. And to give a short definition of the underground cinema, like it is some audiovisual practices that are characterized by innovation, opposition, alternative approaches, decentralization, autonomy, hybridization, transgression, and especially reaction to established norms. It can be also called as amateur cinema, cult films, film clubs, and sometimes we can see even pornography or porn films, and that's why they focus on irrationality, play, instinct, etc., etc. Sometimes underground cinema is also called experimental cinema. There are some differences, though, that some authors argue, but I would say that experimental cinema is more focused on the process and the product, and the narrative, performative, technical, and aesthetic, technological, or organizational, distributional characteristics, right? So, just to give a short historic overview, in the 1970s it was called avant-garde independent cinema, and it was a broader movement. Now, later on in the 1980s, it was called abstract film, expanded alternative, parallel film, etc. And in the 1990s, it would be called artist film and video, and it would have a much greater institutional recognition. Then we have got Eric Semaskin, who is a contemporary underground and experimental film curator. And having arrived in France from Ukraine in 2012, he's a young filmmaker with more than a dozen short films that have been selected at many awards and international film festivals. And some critics, what they say is like that he shows a liminal space where deep roots and certain detachments paradoxically exist, and that is what serves as an inspiration for his films, and that he also works from rubbish, as we will see later, and that he does have a personal commitment towards animals and the environment. Now, if time allows us, we'll see some of his films, like of him teasers. I chose House of Mice, Jour de Pêche, Nature Attack, Golden Sea, and Olympic Trash, who basically, all these films talk about animals in the Plasticocene and what I call also the Wasteocene, in the Anthropocene, and they have got some shared aesthetics and semiotics, as you will see. Let me see if this is working, so you can, yeah. Perfect. And then roll the page. As you can see, it's like about someone who's starting to search for a better life, as many authors would state. And then nature attack about a small bird. Okay, so I won't delve into like the deep analysis because we don't have time. As you can see, it's like an anonymous person that is making these poor non-human animals suffer because of our pollution. And then Golden Sea is about a fish that suffers from plastic in the ocean. Capitalism. Okay, and then lastly, we have a documentary Olympic trash about the Paris.
Mais tes gazos qui va devenir.
Il va en manquer un peu ou pas?
Okay, so I wonder if, like, you may notice that they have some things in common. The documentary is a bit different though, but the rest of them, they have some alternative techniques, like such as Eric Semashkin, like he opposes to the Renaissance author concept where he was like a god, like he is the one that makes the receiver, the viewer, think of their impact, and he's not like a god. There is not really an image of him or like trying to make it wow. And then he uses mock-ups and made from recycled materials. I had the chance to interview him, and he said that he collects them from the trash and he puts them in his apartment, and that he uses a budget of sometimes even less than 70 euros per film. I think he even uses 20 euros, so that's why he uses these recycled materials, and he tries to pollute as less as possible. And that he also that is also an ethical point of view or an ethical methodology, because he doesn't want the animals to suffer. There are some living birds or living fish, but he also uses mock-ups in order to avoid using living beings. He also uses the concept of moral fables, because it's like it does have an impact on the receiver, and the message is very easy, because he says that experimental cinema is sometimes a bit confusing to understand because it's experimental and it's very different from mainstream cinema, and that's why he uses a simple message for the viewer to understand it. And then that's why, taking all of this into account, I decided to define all this representation as the techno-animal, right? Because that's why he uses this stop-motion technique, that is, he assembles frame by frame each animal, and he can spend ages doing that. So this is, I would say, techno-animal, which is a very interesting concept. And let me see if I can show you this stop-motion technique just here. That's it. like just a 20-second video can take like second by second, frame by frame, like forever to do, and that's very interesting in this experimental cinema. And that is why that could be defined as a reaction to the mainstream in the 1960s. Like that also happened in the 1960s in the underground cinema, and now the history is repeating itself. And we could even kind of define this aesthetic as the aesthetic of dematerialization. I say materialization and dematerialization because he also draws on these materials, but he tries to deconstruct them too. He tries to deconstruct the materials from the Plasticocene and the Wasteocene, and he portrays the non-human animals as a victim, or we could even state as a refugee from this Anthropocene era through this dematerialization. And he also tries to break this phylogenetic distance because he chooses animals such as fish because of their viscosity, right? That many people, in contrast to mammals that are closer biologically to us, they tend to think that they're much different, and they, for instance, eat fish or think that they suffer less, etc. And that's why he breaks with this species hierarchy, and that is very different from the mainstream traditional documentary. He also uses this subjective camera angle, and there is an absence of voiceover, so we can really delve into the experience of the non-human animal and feel like it or the fish does, and sense what the fish or the animal in question is doing. And by doing that, he also tries to redefine the Einstein's montage theory. Let me see if I can show you how he uses this subjective camera angle. The viewer can feel a lot of different emotions when watching this. For instance, I feel a bit guilty. However, it might also wake up some different, like totally opposite emotions. For instance, some people might think that this is not true. They might feel like negationist towards this type of films, and that is why I would be very interested also in your perspective. Like if you want to talk about it later during the break or whatever, I would be very interested in how you perceive this type of cinema. And he also deconstructs this time and space. Like it is very different from the typical American dream that we see in other films or that we see in other documentaries. Also, like him, like as the realizer, he's not the scientific person that usually films the documentary, right? There's no scientific voice that explains everything. That's why there's an absence of voice. And like for instance, this resembles Anderson, Jean Vigo, Parcoran, Humphrey Jennings, etc. other film creators. And for instance, in the Olympic Games, during this documentation, he documented also that there were 19 people displaced, and that's how he tried to portray these 10 million plastic bottles, right? And try to portray and depict this competitive capitalism, heroism. And this made me think, these shots or these angles from the Dana that happened in Valencia on the 29th of October in 2024. I assume that most of you already know about this. And he also I define all this as zoo cinemacity, which I would define as a critical framework that examines how cinema construct, mediates, and regulates this visibility, agency, and subjectivity of non-human animals, right? He also has a post-humanist representation, and he redefines the notion of what it means to be a good actor of Diderot. We can also talk about it later if you want during the Q&A, and of the viewer because of what I just said. And the animal here is an actor, an archive, and a historical vehicle of our contemporary society. And that is a bit different from what, for instance, we can see in the 19th century French theater. And it also shows how we as humans render non-human animals as disabled, what we would call creep animals. Yeah, he also, like, animals are vectors because, for instance, here he says that the rat, they are symbols of war and symbols of the Ukraine and Russia war, right? They are this Ukraine sector, and however, technology is the Russia sector, and the technological and the destructive sector. Of course, that is also, like, the viewer will not know that unless you talk to him or unless you analyze it. But that is very interesting, and like he also breaks this binarism, and he breaks this perceptual and descriptive anthropocentrism, right? As I said, and then, oh, this is a bit sorry, the etching because if it is maybe, well, don't worry. Here it must be better because I did it in different formats, so there wouldn't be any trouble when. Okay, so. We could say that underground cinema is a valid means to redefine an inhuman animal representation, and that these types of representation forefront, like it stands at a forefront of contemporary representations of non-human animals in the Anthropocene, and then French underground cinema is also a reaction to mainstream cinema. And just in case, I can send you the presentation online if you want to. And here is the bibliography that I used, and here is a QR, just in case you're interested in watching all these films that you usually have to pay for. But since I had the chance to interview Eric Sam asking, there are the films, more films, the passwords to the films. This was just a short selection, and in case the QR is not working, there is this link that you can also have, right?